You know that person who, before a good thing even fully arrives, has already started preparing for it to fall apart? The interview goes well, and they're already rehearsing how the rejection will feel. Someone says, "I love you," and they're quietly waiting for the part where it stops being true. A calm week at work, and they spend most of it scanning for the thing they must have missed. That's not a bad attitude. That's not ingratitude. That's a very specific pattern, and it runs deeper than most people realize. If that sounds like you or someone you know, what you're about to hear might be the first time any of this has actually made sense. Here's what the research actually says. People who expect the worst aren't broken thinkers, they're highly efficient ones. Their system learned at some specific point in some specific context that hope was the most dangerous place to stand. Here's the part nobody warns you about. The expectation of bad outcomes isn't negativity, it's a protection system running exactly as it was designed. The next few minutes are going to show you when that design was built, what it's protecting, and what it has quietly been costing you. The psychological term for this is defensive pessimism, but that label doesn't capture what's actually happening, so let's translate it. Defensive pessimism is when the mind runs worst-case scenarios not out of fear, but out of preparation. The brain decides if I already feel the loss, the actual loss won't destroy me. It's not a character flaw, it's a calibrated response. Something, likely repeated, likely early, taught your system that the gap between hope and reality was a dangerous place to live. So the system closed that gap. It stopped hoping all the way. It started landing early, before impact, and it got very, very good at it. That's not weakness, that's a survival pattern that worked, in the context it was built for. The first layer is what happens to your nervous system when good things occur. You're at dinner, everything is easy. The conversation is warm and unhurried, and somewhere underneath that, something is quietly scanning. Not because you want to ruin it, but because your system has a catalog. Times when calm came directly before something broke. Times when things were fine until they weren't. So the scanning continues. Research by psychologist Julie Norem found that people who use defensive pessimism actually perform better under uncertainty. The strategy reduces anxiety by converting open threat into a known scenario. But the real-world cost is this: you're spending energy on a threat that hasn't arrived, and sometimes never will. And here's the second layer most people miss. The expectation of the worst isn't only about outcomes, it's about identity. At some point, the pattern became self-defining. You started calling yourself a realist, a pragmatist, the one who isn't naive, and that identity began doing something subtle. It made the pattern harder to question, because questioning the pattern meant questioning who you are. Researcher Martin Seligman's work on explanatory style showed that people who consistently explain bad events as permanent and personal develop a predictive filter. They stop just expecting bad outcomes and start expecting them specifically for themselves. The implication? The behavior isn't just protecting you from pain, it's quietly teaching you that pain is your default destination. You were told you were negative, that you couldn't just let yourself be happy, that you always had to find the problem, that you were exhausting to be around when things were going well. None of that was true. What was true is this: you learned very specifically, very early, that relief was temporary, that good things had expiry dates you couldn't see, that it was safer to grieve something before it left than to be blindsided when it did. You weren't being difficult, you were being precise about a world that had been imprecise with you. The scanning, the bracing, the quiet grief for things still present, that wasn't negativity, that was loyalty. You weren't negative, you were loyal to your own survival. That pattern protected you. It made complete sense when it was built. The only question left is whether it still needs to run this hard in a life that may have already become safer than the one that built it. What actually governs this behavior is simpler than most people expect. The system isn't interested in outcomes, it's interested in regulation. Expecting the worst keeps the nervous system in a known state, and a known state, even a painful one, is easier to manage than an uncertain one. That's why reassurance rarely works. You can't logic someone out of a regulation strategy. The brain isn't listening to the argument, it's managing the exposure.
What starts to shift this isn't optimism, it's accumulated evidence, slow, specific, repeated, that the gap between hope and outcome doesn't always end in loss. That takes time, it takes safety, and it rarely happens alone. You weren't wrong for building that system. You were right in the context it was built in. The question isn't whether you're a pessimist or an optimist. The question is, whose world were you calibrated for? And is it still the world you're living in? Leave that in the comments. Were you calibrated for a harder world, or are you still running that system in one that's actually gotten safer? If this explains something you've never had words for, subscribe. That's what every video on this channel is trying to do.